man's cheeks. His lips started working as he stood there. They trembled a little at first, but finally he got it out. "You're a real bad, rotten bitch, aren't you, Diane?" Since it certainly was no question, the young man didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he turned and hurried around the tables to the 3 carpeted steps that led down to the cocktail lounge's foyer. The woman stared after him for a moment or two, her own lips working as though she were still silently rehearsing some undelivered lines. Then she looked down at the table, with its 2 uneaten sandwiches and the spilt beer. She seemed to study the mess carefully, as though she might want to paint it someday from memory. Finally, she looked up at Jackson. He saw that her rage had gone, perhaps drained away into some secret hiding place for possible reuse. She also wore a new expression, one of slightly puzzled dishonesty. "Who's gonna pay for all this shit?" she said. Jackson shook his head. One wonders. She stood up quickly and almost darted around the tables to the 3 steps. "Hey, Johnny," she called, "wait up." But Johnny was long gone. She started down the 3 steps in a hurry, looking for Johnny and not at all where she was going. On the last step, she knocked over Nikolai Ploscatu, the dwarf. The dwarf didn't have far to go, but still he went down hard and landed on his butt. The woman glanced down at him, said, "Ah, shit," by the way of apology, and hurried out the door after the vanished Johnny. Nobody offered to help the dwarf up. He didn't seem to expect it. He rose slowly with considerable dignity and thoughtfully brushed off his hands. After that, he shook his big head in mild disgust and again started up the 3 steps, climbing them one at a time because of his short, slightly bowed legs. Ploscatu made his way through the tables to where Jackson sat. "I'm late," the dwarf said, and hoisted himself up and back into one of the deep chairs with a combined hop and wriggle that seemed practiced. "I'm used to it," Jackson said. "I don't drive," the dwarf said, as though revealing some long-hidden secret. "If you don't drive in this town, you should depend on being late. When I was in New York, I took the subway, and was almost never late. I wonder why they don't have subways here." The dwarf had a noticeable Romanian accent, probably because he had learned his English fairly late in life, long after the French that he spoke with virtually no foreign accent at all, and his almost equally flawless German. During the early part of the war, in 1940 and 41, Ploscatu had worked for British intelligence in Bucharest, or rather for 2 English spies who were posing as correspondents for a couple of London dailies. One of the spies, Ploscatu had once told Jackson, had been rather competent, but the other one, constantly aflutter about a play of his that was being produced in London at the time, had turned out to be pretty much of a bust. When the Germans finally moved into Romania in the spring of 1942, the dwarf had fled to Turkey. From there he had managed to get to Greece, and somehow from Greece to Cairo, where he sometimes claimed to have spent the rest of the war. Although Ploscatu would never admit it, Jackson suspected that the dwarf had somehow had himself smuggled into the United States, possibly by the Army Air Corps. At any rate, the dwarf always spoke warmly of the Air Corps, in spite of what it had done to Ploiești. "You want a drink?" Jackson said. "Did you see her knock me down? She didn't even stop. She didn't pay for her lunch either." The dwarf nodded glumly, as if he had expected something like that. The big head that he had nodded was almost handsome, except for a trifle too much chin. "A martini," he finally replied to Jackson's aging question. "I think I'll have a martini." "Still the barbarian?" "Yes," the dwarf said. "Quite." Jackson signaled for a waiter, who came over and stood, hands on hips, a bleak look on his face, as he surveyed the lunch that the young couple had neither eaten nor paid for. The waiter was young and gossipy, and a bit effeminate. He gave Jackson a knowing look. "Well, I could certainly tell when they came in, couldn't you?" he said. "No," Jackson said, "I couldn't." "Well, I certainly could."